Hello there. In our last couple of videos, episodes 32 and 33, we discussed the need for fire-rated separations between occupancy groups. In one of the videos, on video 33, we talked about one of the exceptions that allows you not to provide that fire separation. But that was limited to accessory occupancies, which in turn are only limited to 10% of the floor area. So what about options when you have projects where the occupancy groups take more than 10% of the floor area? Are there any allowances that allow you not to fire separate those two occupancies? There is. And today we're going to talk about that. Don't go anywhere. You're about to find out. Once again, welcome. My name is Josue Diaz. I am a licensed architect in the state of California, and this is ArchiCorner. If you stuck around, it's because you want to know more about this fire-rated exception between occupancy groups. So, let's get started. In order for us not to have a fire separation between occupancies, the building code does give us an allowance in sections 508.3. This section is titled Non-Separated Occupancies, but as the title suggests, different occupancies may be allowed to be adjacent to one another without having a separation or a fire separation between them. First, we need to find out a few things. One, how many different occupancies do we have in the building? We also need to find out what those occupancies are. And third, we need to find out some typical building information where our project is located. In our last episode, we had an example that included a couple of occupancy groups. You may remember we had an occupancy B and also an occupancy group A3. So for the sake of continuity between these last episodes, we're going to continue with that same example. But just in case you didn't watch that video and you're watching this for the first time, these are the following details on that building. First, we're talking about a building with an A3 and a B occupancy on the same floor. The building is sprinklered, it has 3 stories, and each floor has 20,000 square feet. Also, we didn't provide this information on the last videos, but we need it for this video today. So we're also going to clarify the height. The height for this building is 45 feet tall. Also, we didn't mention the building type, but for this example, we're going to assume that we're using a type 3B building. So now that we have the building information at hand, we can continue on and check off every requirement to see if we can apply for these non-separated occupancy. Which is the first requirement? Well, in the order that I am placing them, hopefully, which is easier to follow, the first requirement would be found in section 508.3.3 of the IBC. And this section talks to us about what occupancy groups cannot be classified as non-separated occupancies. In other words, these following occupancy groups must have a fire separation between them if they're required. So, what are these occupancy groups? They are H2, H3, H4, H5, and also I1, R1, R2, and R3. So, if we have any of those occupancy groups, we cannot take advantage of the non-separated occupancies. But in our case, this is okay because we don't have any of them. We have a B and an A3 occupancy, so we're good to go. This requirement is a check. Let's go on to the next requirement. And that is requirement number 2, which we can find in section 508.3.1 of the IBC. And in this requirement, we have to find out and apply the most restrictive requirements for each of the occupancies based on Chapter 9. Now, this may seem a little complicated because when you look at Chapter 9, you can probably get bogged down. But it's actually quite easy because Chapter 9 breaks it down by occupancy groups, what things are needed for each occupancy group or what items are special to them. Using our example, we look at section 903.2.1.3. Man, these are long sections for Group A. And what this section tells us is that we may need to have fire sprinklers. And what are the requirements that tell us whether or not we need to have fire sprinklers? Well, if the area is larger than 12,000 square feet, if we have more than 300 occupants, or if this area is located on a floor other than the level of exit discharge. In our case, this doesn't apply because, well, it does apply, but what I'm trying to get to is that our building is sprinklered anyway. So it doesn't matter because it's already sprinklered. So this doesn't really apply. But if our building was not sprinklered and we exceeded one of these items, then we would have to sprinkler the building if it was not sprinklered, or we couldn't take advantage of this allowance of the code. The next section is section 906.1 that tells us that in an A occupancy, we must have portable fire extinguishers. But that's pretty much true for every occupancy group. I don't know that there is an occupancy group other than some residential that you don't need to have fire extinguishers. But anyways, you need to have portable fire extinguishers. The third requirement is in section 907.2.1, where it tells us that we need a manual fire alarm if the building is not sprinklered. But in our case, our building is sprinklered. So again, this kind of doesn't apply because we are sprinklered. The building is sprinklered. But we have two occupancies. We've only talked about the A3 occupancy. What about the B occupancy? And you can find that in section 907.2.2 of the IBC, where it tells us that we might need a fire alarm if the building is not sprinklered. If our building is not sprinklered, then we need to check and see if the combined occupant load of all floors is more than 500. And if so, it needs to have a fire alarm. Also, if there are more than 100 people above or below the lowest level of exit discharge, we also need to provide a fire alarm. But in our case, as mentioned before, we're already sprinklered, so this doesn't really apply. So in our example, we need fire sprinklers, we need to have portable fire extinguishers, and both of those are good to go. So we can check this requirement off and go on to our next one. That takes us to requirement number 3, and you can find that in IBC section 508.3.1.1 of the building code. And in this requirement, we're going to have to find out if we're working in a high-rise building. And what exactly is a high-rise building? Well, chapter 2 defines a high-rise building as a building that has more than 75 feet in height. As we mentioned before, our building is not that tall, so it really doesn't apply to us. But if our building was in fact a high-rise building, then we have to make sure that this complies, or that the building complies with IBC section 403, which is a section that talks about requirements for high-rise buildings. Now, this is important because this allowance of the code, we don't want to apply it to a building that is very old and perhaps doesn't comply and is already a non-compliant building. Here in California, we may not run into that very often, but in the East Coast where where there is buildings that are much older, it is possible that those non-compliant buildings may not comply with this section 403 of the IBC. We're not going to go through it in detail, but just so that you know, some of the things that are required in a high-rise building per this section are sprinklers, fire alarms, smoke detection, and standpipes. So if your building complies with these, you might be able to continue on, but just know that if you have a high-rise building and you're working with an older building, you may not, or your building may not comply with this section. In our example, again, we have a building that is not that tall. It's only 45 feet tall, and therefore it's not considered a high-rise. So check, we're good with this requirement. So 3 for 3 so far. We're going on to the fourth requirement. What is that? Well, in the IBC, we go to section 508.3.1.2, and this is a very specific requirement for a very specific occupancy group. We're not going to go too much into detail because, again, it's very specific, but just know that if you do have an occupancy group I2, there are special requirements, but again, since in our example, we don't have a group I2 in this building, then we meet this requirement. So check, and going on to the next requirement. But again, just as a quick recap, if you do have a group I2, then you have to make sure you look into the specific requirement that you can find in section 508.3.1.2 of the IBC. So moving on to the next requirement. This is requirement number 5. And you can find that in section 508.3.2 of the building code. In this section of the building code, it tells us that we have to find out the most restrictive allowance for our building height, the number of stories, and the building area for each one of our occupancies, and apply the most restrictive one. Let's run through this example for our project. We have a B occupancy group and an A3 occupancy group. So let's take a look at what's allowed for each one of these and see if we comply. First, we talk about building height. We can take a look at table 504.3 of the building code and see that for both A and B occupancy groups in a type 3B building, we are allowed to have a maximum of 75 feet in height if the building is sprinklered, which we are. And in this case, our building is only 45 feet in height, so we're fine. We are under the 75 feet, we're good. What about the number of stories? This is where it does get a little different for the different occupancies. When we take a look at table 504.4 of the building code, we see that an A3 occupancy is allowed to go up to 3 stories, but a B occupancy is only allowed to go up to 4 stories in a type 3B building. In our example, we mentioned how we only have 3 stories, so we do meet the most restrictive, right? Because A3 is the most restrictive, only allowing 3 total stories, so we're good. Now, the third requirement is the building area. Again, it's very different for the 2 occupancies based on the building type. An A3 occupancy, if we look at table 506.2, we are allowed 28,500 square feet, and for a B occupancy, we're allowed 57,000 square feet. We compare that to what we actually have, 20,000 square feet, so we are under that. If we take a look at the most restrictive requirements for a B and an A3, we know that in a summary, we are only allowed 75 feet maximum height, which we are under, we only have 45. We are only allowed to have a 3-story max allowance, and that is what we have, so that's good. And we are allowed to have 28,500 square feet per floor max, and we are under that max. We are only 20,000 square feet. So this 5th requirement, we check off. So I know it was a bit long, but we check off all the requirements, all 5 requirements that there are, so that we can classify our B and A3 occupancies as non-separated occupancies. This allows us to have the areas, it doesn't matter how big or how much room they take in the building or in the floor. We do not need to fire rate these occupancies because they comply with this section of non-separated occupancies. I know it was a lot to cover, but it's really not that complicated once you do it once. I've done this quite a few times in a lot of my projects and are able to get through this without really much thinking nowadays because it's just a process. So once you get it down, it's quite a simple process. But what about you? Have you used this in the past? If you have, I'd be interested to hear about it. Leave it in a comment below. Let us know what your experiences have been that you didn't know before. Well, now you know. Now it's something else that you can put a feather in your cap, more knowledge to you. Till next time, this is Archie Corner, signing out.